Good evening, and welcome to Twilight Tales. Tonight, let yourself be carried away by the story of Joan of Arc, a humble shepherdess with a heavenly destiny, whose courage reignited hope in a wounded France. Get comfortable, relax, breathe deeply, and let yourself be lulled by this incredible story. Chapter 1. The Call and the Departure. Domrémy, native land. The morning rose over the hills of Domrémy like a diaphanous veil brushing against the foliage still heavy with dew. At the first rays of sunlight, the wheat stalks swayed under the caress of a warm breeze, whispering ancient prayers to the rhythm of the clouds. On the horizon, the pyramid-like silhouette of Saint Remy Church stood out against a sky of uncertain blue, promising a new day in the heart of war-torn Lorraine. In the Arc family's farmhouse, a flame already flickered in the kitchen hearth. Jan, an 18-year-old with piercing eyes, watched over the baking of a piece of rye bread while her brothers busied themselves milking the goats. The scent of warm milk mingled with the sharper aroma of sizzling bacon in an iron pan. Around the table, faces were weathered by toil and vigilance. Each wrinkle bore witness to seasons of war, to the silent fear nestled in the hearts of the peasants. She placed her hand on the rough wood of the door, caressing the carved arch that secured its latch. That morning, a premonition struck her like lightning. The roosters crowed the dawn, but in her eyes a prophetic gleam danced, as if the archangel Michael himself had whispered her name in the wind. A shiver ran down her spine. She heard, though not certain, a distinct murmur amid the breath of the hills, "Go, daughter of France." The villagers, in their simplicity, went about their tasks, repairing a chestnut cart to deliver flour, mending a hen-house fence gnawed by wild rabbits. Yet some glances turned toward her, as if they sensed the same sacred spark. Jeanne felt their curiosity pierce the morning's tranquility, and she had to lean against the freshly sanded doorframe to keep from faltering. At the village fountain, water flowed with a steady gurgle. She approached and plunged her hands into it, feeling the biting cold through her cloth gloves. A silvery reflection shimmered on the surface, her own face, marked by fierce determination. She murmured, in a voice caught by the silence, "I am but a peasant girl, yet I hear—" The words faded into the air, carried away by the distant cawing of crows perched on the red-tiled roofs. In the house, her mother arranged trays of wild cherries, offered as an oblation to the Virgin. On the table, a dark wooden rosary rested, its beads worn from the morning prayer. Jeanne gazed at those polished beads, witnesses to a spiritual refuge. She felt the weight of her calling settle on her frail shoulders, a mission too vast for her, yet irresistible. A ray of sunlight pierced through the small window, casting a golden halo around the crucifix on the wall. She recognized it as a sign. She must leave this room with its ancient beams to answer a call greater than herself. The echo of horse hooves suddenly rang out on the dirt path. The local lord's herald, bearing dispatches, approached at full gallop. Jeanne stepped out of the house, her boots crushing twigs underfoot. A few meters away, the messenger, raising the visor of his helm, gave her a questioning look. Are you Jean? His ragged breath filled the air with a light dust. She nodded, her heart pounding. I am. The messenger drew a letter sealed with red wax, stamped with the king's arms, and handed it to her with solemn gravity. The Dauphin awaits you at Chinon. The parchment unfurled between her fingers like a missive from another world. The royal words flowed, irrevocable, summoning her to defend the kingdom. Around her, the bird song seemed to fade, giving way to the weight of destiny. A crow flew over the roof beams, a dark and familiar omen, guardian of mysteries. Her mother, alerted by the commotion, appeared in the doorway, her face pale. You're leaving? Her voice trembled, heavy with unshed tears. Jane approached her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. I do not choose, mother. I obey what I have heard for months. A silence fell, suspended like an unfinished musical note. Then her mother nodded, broken by faith and love. Then may God carry you, my daughter. In the courtyard, the villagers gathered, forming a silent circle around the young girl. Their silhouettes stood like benevolent shadows. The blacksmith with powerful arms, the little girl, her palms stained with blackberries, the old shepherd clutching his carved staff. All sought to unravel the enigma of her call. Jeanne raised her eyes to the bell tower, to the sky still dotted with mournful clouds, and said in a clear voice, May the Eternal guide my steps, and may the breath of the saints accompany me. She mounted her horse, dressed in a simple robe edged with hand-painted fleur-de-lis, an echo of her mission. Her gaze turned to the road winding through dark woods and vibrant meadows. Beyond, the shadow of war loomed, with its catapults, crenellated walls, and torn banners. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp earth, trampled grass, and freshly cut wood. In this aromatic bouquet she heard again an inner voice. Go, daughter of the homeland. The horse neighed, impatient, as if urging her to cross the threshold. She placed a foot in the stirrup, adjusted the reins, and with a light tap of her heel, set off toward the east. The bells of Domrémy rang, heralding her solemn departure. The wind, an invisible accomplice, lifted her chestnut hair, draping her in a light aura. Thus began her journey, borne by the hope of a wounded France and the promise to forge a path of light beyond the darkness. The First Visions. In the spring of 1425, as the shadow of conflict spread over Lorraine, Jean remained alone in the dark attic of the family farmhouse. The ancient beams exhaled the scent of resin and dust, mingled with freshly cut wood shavings. Seated on an old pine chest, she spun wool under the pale light of a narrow skylight. The outside world reached her in echoes, the distant bleating of a sheep, the rustling of leaves in the morning breeze, and the faint clinking of a blacksmith at work. Unbeknownst to her, a lighter breath swept through the room like the murmur of a wing brushing the rafters. Jean looked up toward the roof's ridge, her heart pounding. A stream of indistinct words seemed to ripple through the stagnant air. Jean, Jean. The words gleamed in her mind, both gentle and urgent, like the echo of an unreachable bell. The wool slipped from her fingers, and a shiver ran down her spine, awakening a sacred fear within her. Kneeling on the rough plank floor, she clasped her hands. closing her eyes to listen more closely. In the silence of the beams, the voices clarified. 3 distinct tones, one deep and noble, another tender and melodious, the third vibrant with celestial authority. They spoke her name like a vow. Daughter of the Lord, heed our holy words. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, while the surrounding darkness seemed to glow with an inner light. When she opened her eyes, a harsh light pierced the skylight, casting a halo of an imagined apparition on the wall. Jean felt her eyelids heavy, as if weighed down by a veil of mystery. The fibers of the linen cloth trembled. She thought she saw in the dancing motes of dust angelic forms taking shape, suspended between shadow and light. At her feet, the wool began to crackle as if touched by an invisible ember. She dared to ask, "Who are you, O voices of the heavens?" Her voice trembled, but the words came clearly. Immediately the deep voice answered, "Michael, leader of the heavenly armies. With my sword I combat iniquity." The clear voice added, "Margaret, your sister in faith, I watch over your purity." Finally, the gentle yet grave voice concluded, "Catherine, bride of Christ, I guide you toward your destiny." Each name resonated in Jean like the echo of a divine drum. She felt a diffuse warmth flood her body, starting from her heart and filling her limbs with newfound strength. A subtle hum vibrated in the beams, as if the universe itself held its breath. The scent of blooming lily of the valley slipped through the skylight's frame. The white flower seemed to reach toward her, a vessel of invisible grace. Trembling, Jeanne murmured a prayer learned in her earliest childhood, her lips articulating each word with a childlike fervor. "Lord, make me your humble instrument." The voices fell silent for a moment, leaving a vibrant silence of miracle. Then, as if carried by a secret wind, a new message slipped into her mind. "Go deliver France. Save the kingdom from the English. Break the chains that enslave your people." These words, imbued with both maternal tenderness and martial command, sparked a profound vertigo within her. In the distance, the church bells rang the Angelus. The metallic sound crashed against the stone wall, and Jeanne thought she heard in each chime the call of her homeland. She knew then that her destiny would never again be that of a simple shepherdess. In the months that followed, the visions recurred, always at dawn or dusk, at the bend of a path, or amid the muffled clamor of the village choir's prayers. Each apparition refined her purpose. Sometimes a flaming rampart, sometimes an immaculate banner waving before a misty horizon. The voices gradually taught her the art of discerning truth among shadows. Keep your mind clear. Know how to listen to the voice of the people and fear not their judgments. She found herself spending hours gazing at the landscape, searching in each cloud for a sign of her mission. The wheat bent under the weight of summer, the streams carried a murmur of hope, and the bird songs reached her like fragments of prophecy. One evening, as a red moon rose behind the hills, she raised her arms to the sky. "Show me the way!" And in a blazing breath, celestial light descended in a spiral, etching in her heart the certainty of walking under the protection of the saints. When the time came to share these miracles with her family, Jeanne doubled her caution and fervor. She confided in her intimate confessor, an old priest with a wrinkled face, recounting her supernatural encounters. The man, wavering between fear of heresy and awe, placed his calloused hand on her shoulder. "If God speaks to you, my daughter, follow the voice of truth." In those simple words, the destiny of the Maid of Domrémy was sealed, ready to embark on an adventure that would forever change the course of history. Toward Chinon and the court. In the early summer of 1429, Jean left Domrémy on a black palfrey with a slender neck and glossy hooves, escorted by a few trusted squires. Dawn was barely breaking when the convoy set out on the dirt path, rutted with tracks from hurried carts and ancient furrows. The morning mist hovered over the meadows, draping the countryside in a diaphanous veil, while the air, saturated with spring freshness, carried the sharp scent of ferns and the faint tang of blooming hawthorns. Each league traveled offered Jeanne a new tableau. Groves scarred by war's fires, abandoned vineyards where rusted vine stakes peeked through the foliage, and sometimes in a ditch a tattered banner's pole, a silent vestige of a nocturnal ambush. Even the birds sang warily, their trills hesitant as if they feared the presence of enemy soldiers. A jay flew before her, ruffling the air with its azure feathers. She saw it as an omen, a warning for the reckless and encouragement for one advancing under divine grace. The convoy soon crossed the border of the marsh, where local lords, torn between loyalty and self-interest, had erected sturdy fortifications of palisades and watchtowers. The guard posts stood as frontier sentinels, their wooden hoardings casting menacing shadows on the road. Jeanne signaled her companions to slow, her gaze probing the battlements, watching for any movement. The air echoed with the rhythmic creaking of wheels on pebbles, a sound from a time when France's balance teetered under English and Burgundian pressure. When they reached the banks of the Vienne River, the heat intensified like a blast from a furnace. The still waters shimmered under the sun, edged with light foam. The ferry, gliding between two taut chains, seemed to float in the azure, bearing promises and doubts. Jeanne placed her hand on her horse's flank, feeling the silent vibration of the beast. Then, without a word, she led the convoy to the opposite bank, crossing the current amid the creaking of planks and groaning pulleys. On the Touraine shore, the land was more fertile. Tall grasses, fields of flax already woven with blue and white threads. On the horizon, the proud silhouette of Chinon emerged, crowned by its granite ramparts. The massive towers, sculpted by the winds, seemed to defy the sky. Jeanne felt her heart swell with emotion. It was here she must speak to the Dauphin, where her destiny would begin to shift. The path climbed a hillside dotted with thickets and gorse, their thorns crunching under the squire's steps. The first chimes of Saint-Méloire des Andes bells reached them, clear and solemn, resonating in the valley. Jeanne looked up. The sound seemed to echo off the ancient stones, carrying a sacred message. As they approached, houses aligned in a mosaic of slate and the workshops of weavers, apothecaries, and bookbinders. The curious townsfolk paused at their doorways, whispering exclamations. "It's the maid!" or "Glory to God!" She did not smile. She remained impassive, her gaze fixed on the castle's austere silhouette. Yet she felt the collective energy of the town, a breath of hope that invigorated her companions. Barefoot children ran behind the convoy, waving laurel branches or makeshift flower crowns. Even the beggars, turning their gaze to the young woman, murmured in hoarse voices, "May she deliver us." When they reached Chinon's gate, a vaulted passage wrought with iron and oak opened before them. A watchman cast a sweeping glance, verified the royal order, then lowered the drawbridge. The wheels creaked on the stone ramp, and the air in the inner courtyard vibrated with the clatter of armor and the clinking of swords. Jean, dismounting, removed her polished helm, revealing her chestnut hair tied in a simple braid. She inhaled deeply. The scent of warm stone, mingled with the acrid smell of metal, filled her nostrils. In the courtyard center, planted lances formed a forest of gleaming points. The onlookers whispered among themselves, "The Dauphin has never received a shepherdess. He'll tell us what madness drives a girl to come here." Jean strode forward with purpose, her boots striking the stone with determination. She turned to one of the squires. "Lead me to Charles VII." A herald bowed before her. "Approach, mademoiselle. The king awaits you in the guard-room." He pointed to a spiral staircase, its steps polished by generations of footsteps. Torches along the walls cast dancing shadows, like faint prayers orbiting around her. The walls, covered with tapestries depicting the Capetian lineage, whispered the story of a kingdom in peril. In the guard-room, the guards formed two rows, their faces impassive. Behind them, a mustard-colored curtain concealed the door to the great hall. They offered her a simple, carved wooden chair, almost frail amid the gleaming armors. Jean sat, folding her hands on her knees, her fingers clasped as if holding an invisible object. Her calm gaze scanned the heavy curtain as if she could already read the Dauphin's thoughts. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then a soft step echoed. The king, still incognito, entered the room, dressed in a simple robe, his face hidden under a green hood. Jeanne remained still, her breath held. He walked toward her, stopped a few paces away, and slowly removed his hood. His youthful features, tinged with a secret melancholy, were revealed. The Dauphin lowered his eyes, showing respect, laced with unease. "Maid of Lorraine, I have summoned you. Why do you bear the sword of heaven?" Jean raised her head, her sparkling eyes locking onto the prince's. Her voice, clear and steady, broke the silence. "Sire, I am neither knight nor courtier. I am God's instrument. Through me, he commands you to receive your crown at Reims and drive out the invader." Around them, the guards tensed, and a shiver ran through the room like a gust of ice. The Dauphin pursed his lips, hesitating as he replaced his hood, then dared to ask, "And your visions? How can their truth be proven?" At these words, Jeanne stood, walking slowly toward him. Each step echoed in the room, her boots brushing the floor like a faint knell. She stopped before him, raised her hand to her heart, and declared solemnly, "I will name your knights, rally your barons, and reveal to the people the God who watches over France. If I lie, may my sword crumble to dust. If I speak true, may the bannerets swear fealty to their king." The Dauphin, touched by the brilliance of her conviction, crossed his arms. Silence fell, profound. Finally, he murmured, "May God guide you, maid. We shall see if your faith upholds your hope." In the flickering torchlight, John bowed. At that moment, a gust of wind seemed to slip under the curtains, lifting a corner of tapestry to reveal the royal crest. 3 fleurs-de-lis on an azure field, a promise of a kingdom to restore. She knew then that the game was afoot. The celestial voice had led her here, and now nothing could turn her from her destiny. Chapter 2. Orléans and the Loire Campaign, Mobilization and Strategy. In the heart of summer 1429, the city of Orléans stood as a final bastion at the gates of the Loire Valley, hemmed in by English war machines. The broad, sluggish river flowed slowly, reflecting the high, iron-studded walls in its liquid mirror. Siege towers, bristling with platforms and machicolations, cast their massive shadows on the water, while English crossbowmen perched on the ramparts tirelessly scanned for any sign of life behind the embrasures. Within, the inhabitants held firm, driven by stubborn courage, but hunger, thirst, and despair were slowly eroding the defenders' morale. When Jeanne d'Arc arrived near the city, escorted by a small detachment, the rumor spread like wildfire. "The Maid approaches!" In the hot air, laden with dust and stone fragments, faded flags bearing the French crown's colors waved faintly. The French captains, gathered under the Dauphin's ensign, struggled to coordinate reinforcements and supplies. They welcomed Jeanne, without uniform or finery, clad in a simple chainmail coat and a coarse robe, as if their salvation depended less on a war leader than on a supernatural force. The officers, probing her gaze, soon realized that her mere presence rekindled hope even in the most disheartened ranks. Under the sunlit sky, a war council convened near the Burgundy Gate. Plans were spread on a makeshift table, sketches of breached ramparts, catapult positions, crossbowmen's firing lines. Engineers demonstrated the relative effectiveness of battering rams against the portcullis, while gunners assessed the range of siege weapons, trebuchets, cuirassiers, and organ guns. In the shade of an oak, Jeanne listened silently to these debates, her eyes tracing each chalk line on the parchment. She scrutinized the flaws in the enemy's setup, detecting a blind spot behind a collapsed bastion. When her turn came to speak, she stepped forward, firmly. Her voice, clear and vibrant, cut through the crowd's murmur. "We will strike where their machines cannot reach, at dawn, by the Saint Laurent Bridge." A shiver ran through the assembly. The leaders exchanged wary glances, and one interrupted, "Mademoiselle, the bridge is guarded by 2 towers and walls 14 feet thick." Jeanne smiled without arrogance. "Then we will use the supply barges as shields. The archers will mass at their flanks, and at the signal we will force the breach." All recognized in this audacity the echo of divine inspiration. By nightfall, supplies, gunpowder barrels, and grappling hooks were gathered. The Dauphin's carpenters worked through the night, reinforcing a sturdy barge's hull, while archers sharpened their bolts, ready to scale any wall. Jeanne moved among the ranks, encouraging pikemen and grasping each soldier's arm, as if absorbing their fear. "Fight for your families, fight for France." Her piercing blue gaze seemed to rekindle faith in every heart. In the pre-dawn cold, mist floated above the Loire like a sacred veil. The barges, suspended above the water by ropes, awaited the signal. By torchlight, knights donned their spurs, and Oliphant horn-blowers broke the silence with a muffled call. Jeanne, at the convoy's head, raised her white standard adorned with fleurs de lis and golden crosses. The banner, lifted by the breeze, became a blazing beacon in the fog. When the trumpet finally sounded, a low rumble shook the night. The barges surged toward the bridge, crashing into the stone piers with stunning force. Sparks flew as spilled gunpowder ignited, plunging the enemy sector into panic. As smoke thickened, Jeanne leaped onto the bridge, her sword raised like a divine blade. "For France!" At her side, the soldiers followed with newfound vigor, driven by her cry and the distant echo of holy visions. At rising dawn, the sun pierced the smoke, revealing a gaping breach in the wall. From the burning tower, the English were seen retreating in disarray, yielding ground to French determination. Shouts of triumph mingled with the guard dogs' mourning barks. Hope was reborn, and Orléans, once besieged, opened again to the light. Amid this victorious chaos, Jeanne stood still, her chainmail stained with soot and blood, a grave smile lighting her face. Divine strategy and human valor had sealed the maid's first victory. The relief of Orléans. The first ray of sunlight filtered through the lingering mist above the Loire, turning the battered city walls into golden gleams. The previous night's flames had given way to a solemn silence, broken only by the lapping of water against the overturned barge hulls and the faint moans of the wounded laid on makeshift shrouds. On the Saint Laurent bridge, twisted grills and dislodged stones bore the imprint of a daring assault. But the gaping breach in the wall now opened the way to hope. In streets cluttered with debris, residents cleared corpses from the collapsed ramparts, reciting prayers on their bruised lips. Children, frozen in their rags, watched the cleanup like a strange ceremony, while the elderly gathered near the gates, breathing the thick air of dust and gunpowder. At every street corner, impromptu frescoes of blood and mud recalled the siege's cost, an allegory of suffering and salvation etched with care on the walls. Jeanne d'Arc, still clad in her soot-blackened chainmail, moved slowly through the crowd, her features drawn with emotion. She walked to the Notre Dame d'Orléans Cathedral, which had miraculously escaped the flames. The nave stood watch over the city like a silent sentinel. In the choir, priests knelt, murmuring a Te Deum, lulled by the shiver of ancient vaults. When Jeanne crossed the massive threshold, a murmur rose, "There is she who delivered us." She knelt before the high altar, placing her sword on the stone floor as if offering her weapon in homage. The scent of consumed candles floated in the air, mingled with the sharper smell of iron and dried blood. In this sacred space, the maid let her tears fall, a symbol of the compassion she bore for every soul battered by the siege. The faithful mingled their sobs with hers, weaving a moment of mystical communion between defense and faith. Emerging, Jeanne found the French captains gathered before a makeshift scaffold. Each, their faces covered in soot, turned to her, and the eldest spoke, his voice choked. "Maid, without your courage, this city would have fallen. How can we give thanks?" She placed her hand on the old man's shoulder and replied calmly, "This triumph belongs to all, to the residents who did not yield, to the knights who fought, to the angels who guided us. Orléans will rise again as long as its people keep faith." Beyond the walls, French flags snapped in the rising breeze. The fleur-de-lis banner was hoisted again atop the recaptured towers. Artillery salvos celebrated the victory, sending plumes of white smoke skyward, a sign that the king and government could now rely on this liberated city against the invader. Jean watched this martial ritual with a faint smile. In her gaze shone the fierce light of undimmed determination, ready to ignite the rest of the kingdom. As the sun rose, dispersing the last clouds of dust, the maid took the path to the Falaise Tower, Orléans' highest point. From there, she gazed over the valley, dotted with battered fields, ruined villages, and uprooted vines. But beneath this broken landscape, the morning's gold illuminated a freed river and a living city. She murmured, "France, I have sworn you loyalty, and I will march again to Reims, so your king may find his crown." The echoes of her promise faded into the distance, bearing the dawn of a new chapter in her epic. The continuation of the campaign. The day after the siege of Orléans, in the still damp dawn of June 11th, 1429, the small French army left the liberated city under a sky swirling with thick, dark clouds, an omen of coming storms. Most banners were furled, fixed to poles. Only the maid's standard, white and adorned with fleur-de-lis, flew high, buffeted by a humid wind. Jeanne d'Arc, her helm tucked under her arm, marched at the head, feeling the earth vibrate under the horses' steps. She breathed the heavy air, laden with the scent of plowed earth and crushed ferns, as if each irregularity in the ground whispered memories of past battles. At her side, Captains La Hire and Xaintrailles gathered around her, scanning the horizon where the compact silhouette of Jargeau emerged, its tower shrouded in morning mist. When the column reached the outskirts of Jargeau on June 12th, the étang de la Pitié sparkled in the gray light, fringed with tall grasses and rustling reeds. The English, entrenched behind walls of brick and rubble, had been stockpiling supplies for days, convinced the city would hold until reinforcements arrived. But Jean dismounted and placed her hand on the embankment. "We will strike at dawn," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the ruined towers. That night, ladders were set up, stone throwers amassed, and a trench dug to approach the walls. A fine rain fell, turning the ground to mud. It pattered on helmets in a steady rhythm, like a war drum. On the morning of June 13th, word spread that the Dauphin had sent a coded message, "Advance under the sign of the Rose," signaling that supplies would arrive by barges disguised as the civilian convoy. Jean, wrapped in a soaked cloak, raised her sword toward the besiegers. "For Jargeau, for France!" The stone throwers launched their missiles into the gray sky, and French crossbowmen positioned their bolts within range. The English, caught off guard, returned fire with arrows, but a thunderstorm broke, and thunder drowned their morale. Sparks flew from siege machines as lightning struck an enemy flagpole, igniting a powder reserve. With a restrained cry of joy, Jean ordered the charge. The men scaled the collapsed wall, planted the banner on the city gate, and drove out the English defenders, many of whom were taken a prisoner. Without granting her troops a moment's rest, the Maid pressed on toward Meung-sur-Loire. On June 15th, the Loire mirrored a pool of ink under a veiled sun, and Meung's medieval ramparts, bristling with machicolations, rose like savage teeth. At the stone bridge, Jeanne gazed at the dark water, murmuring a hymn to the Virgin. "Guide my steps, may your angels uphold our lances." The cavalry crossed the trembling structure, their hooves chilling the surface, while the infantry formed a spearhead. The small but seasoned English garrison opened fire from the battlements. Cannonballs ricocheted off the stone, spraying rock shards into the air, but the French homicans had prepared a convoy of carts hidden behind neutral flags. Suddenly, at the signal of a muffled trumpet, galloping horses burst into the castle courtyard, surprising the English and forcing their immediate surrender. The Lord of Meung, kneeling before Jeanne, begged for mercy, swearing allegiance to King Charles VII. 3 days later, on June 18th, the Battle of Patay loomed as the campaign's decisive clash. Warm southern winds rippled the ripe wheat, and flocks of crows swirled above the plain, cawing as if warning of impending slaughter. Jeanne stood on a grassy knoll, her silhouette stark against the golden expanse, while her captains refined the cavalry's formation. La Hire, his face dust-covered, exchanged a knowing glance with Montauban. "They don't expect us in tight formation." The Maid nodded, raising her hand. "Wait for my signal." When a lightning bolt suddenly streaked the sky, like a sign from paradise, Jeanne let out a piercing cry. A volley of arrows split the air, breaking English cohesion. The cavalry charged, dust rising in opalescent clouds, and swords were unsheathed like the direst of curses. The English, stunned by the head-on attack without artillery to counter, scattered, abandoning their arquebuses and ensigns. Amid the chaos, a trumpet signaled their rout. Jeanne herself charged toward the enemy center, her standard fluttering like a nomad of the skies. There she crossed swords with an English captain, exchanged a martial salute, then drove back the enemy line with a flick of her wrist. By evening, under a crimson dusk, the Patay plain was littered with horse carcasses and hundreds of abandoned standards. Broken lance shafts still scraped the ground, and the stench of dead beasts mingled with gunpowder's reek. Jeanne walked the battlefield, praying for the fallen and ordering the removal of the wounded. The exhausted but exhilarated French survivors rallied around her. The Maid, her face stained with soot and dried blood, raised her voice with force. "France is reborn from its blood and faith. Tomorrow we march to Reims." That night, as torches danced over the tents and bards sang warlike hymns, a moonbeam pierced the clouds, illuminating the royal crest painted on the helmets. The soldiers saw in it the promise of a destiny greater than victory. And on the horizon, Chartres towers already loomed, a temporary milestone before the final triumph at Reims, where the crown would regain its luster under the authority of Charles VII and Jeanne d'Arc, the instrument chosen by heaven to save her people. Chapter 3. Coronation and the Push to Reims. From Chinon to Reims. At the break of dawn on June 17, 1429, Chinon awoke under a leaden sky, heavy with threatening raindrops. Jeanne d'Arc, clad in a light doublet, edged with fleur-de-lis, stepped out of the castle alongside the Dauphin, now flanked by his most loyal barons. The ancient walls, glistening with rain, seemed to flow like a curtain of steel, and the clanging of sheathed swords echoed in the courtyard, a call to arms. The maid, her step steady, gazed at the bell towers standing as gray shadows over the Loire valley, and in her eyes sparked the promise of the coming coronation. The procession took the eastward road, following the Vienne valley, lined with trembling alders and weeping willows whose branches brushed the muddy waters. The horses trotted through the mire, kicking up splashes of mud that fell in dull thuds. At each relay, exhausted mounts and leather harnesses were replaced, while carts laden with supplies bore the royal standards. Street by street, peasants knelt and clasped their hands, murmuring prayers for the journey's success. May Saint-Rémy protect this procession. Leaving Poitiers, the landscape opened onto barren hills studded with smoking stumps. The winding road climbed toward the Chinonais forest, a haunt of wolves and brigands. Wary local lords, cautious of the maid's radiance, erected palisades at the forest's edge. Archers were stationed in ambush, watching for any convoy. Guided by a premonition, Jean ordered the scouts to negotiate passage and provisions. Let your words reflect God's light, not the shadow of mistrust. Her clear voice pierced the heavy, drizzly atmosphere. The first obstacle arose at the Tranchée Bridge. A charred beam, pressed against a broken pillar, blocked the Vienne's flow. Carpenters armed themselves with axes and oak wedges, while Jeanne stepped onto the bank, feeling the wet stone under her boots. She touched the lichen-covered rock and rested her forehead against it in silence, as if listening to the river's voice. Open, path of France! At these unspoken words, 3 crows emerged from the woods, circling high in the sky, then landing on the broken trunk, an ill omen for the enemy, a promise of passage for the sacred procession. When the bridge was cleared, the convoy crossed cautiously, the horses straining under the effort. Jeanne led, her white banner stark against the gray sheet of the swollen river. In every face that followed, she read the same hope, that of a coronation to finally unite the Capetians. At noon, in a fern-covered clearing, the maid raised her hand to halt. A makeshift altar of flat stones and red cloth was erected, and the chaplain improvised a traveling mass. Chants rose under the canopy of branches, blending Gregorian tones with the cooing of blackbirds, creating a wild and poignant liturgy. The rain resumed as they left the forest, turning paths into torrents of black mud. Horses slipped, carts bogged down, and faces were streaked with heavy droplets. A lightning bolt streaked the sky, and thunder roared like a celestial cry. Jean removed her helm, letting the water stream over her blonde locks. She clasped her hands and prayed, "Lord, make this journey a triumph for your France." Instantly, a light breeze parted the clouds, revealing a uniformly clear sky, prompting a cheer among her companions. Miracle! The next day, the Champagne plain unfolded before them, a sea of ripe wheat, rippling in the breeze. Villages, aligned like sun-bleached pearls, greeted the procession with colorful pavilions. Jeanne, perched on a stone outcrop, pointed to the distant silhouette of Reims, recognizable by its white limestone spires. There, the cathedral awaits us. Her cry pierced the silence, and the men rallied. Horses galloped, banners snapped, and the ground trembled under the surge of an army galvanized by the promise of the coronation. Approaching Reims, the procession passed war's witnesses, still smoking ruins, makeshift cemeteries, and freed captives clinging to the horses' skirts, begging for mercy and salvation. Jeanne embraced them, wiping dust from their faces and whispering, "Stay loyal to the king, for his hour is coming." The barons, moved, watched this 20-year-old perform a political miracle through the strength of her faith. At the sacred city's threshold, the stone gates opened with a rumble of chains. The guards, in gilded helmets, laid down their arms at the approach of the fleur-de-lis banner. The Notre Dame de Reims Cathedral, monumental witness to Capetian coronations, stood tall, its Gothic sculptures testifying to a 1,000-year history. Jeanne, pausing before the parvis, raised her arms toward the chiseled facade. A sunray pierced the central rose window, casting a kaleidoscope of colors on her chainmail. At that moment, she knew the final stage of her journey was complete. The Dauphin's coronation loomed as a crowning of hope for all of France. The coronation of King Charles VII. On July 17, 1429, Reims awoke in golden light, each red-tiled roof gleaming like a jewel under the rising sun. The cobblestone streets came alive at dawn, merchants unfurling their stalls, bearers of studded Capetian banners, pilgrims in rags, and nobles in crimson velvet converging toward the great Notre Dame Cathedral. The air carried the dense scent of consumed candles, mingled with thick incense smoke and the acrid tang of burnt wood. A distant melody of olifants and drums pulsed through the human tide flowing toward the sacred parvis. At the crowd center, Jeanne d'Arc walked with a steady pace, her white standard floating above her head like an immaculate beacon. Her chainmail gleamed faintly in the first rays, each link reflecting a silent prayer. At her side, the Dauphin, clad in a blue silk tunic edged with ermine, followed, his face grave yet lit with hope. In Charles VII's eyes, the young warrior saw the trust she had reignited, the promise of a united kingdom. On the parvis, they were greeted by a clamor of bells. Over 100 chimes rang out, their vibrations reaching the city's outskirts. The archbishop, in full pontifical attire, stood at the foot of the monumental staircase, his mitre high and golden chasuble embroidered with biblical motifs. He raised his hand, blessing the crowd. "May the peace of the Lord be upon you on this blessed day." A sacred silence fell, broken only by the crackling of candles and the breath of knights. The procession entered the nave, where Gothic vaults soared out of sight, forming a portico of shadow and light. Stained glass cast ruby and sapphire gleams on the white stone, projecting a vivid kaleidoscope on the worn slabs. Gregorian chants rose, carried by the deep voice of a master chanter and the crystalline sopranos of a children's choir. The cathedral's acoustics transformed each note into a sacred wave, making the faithful shiver as sacred pollen and incense dust danced in the day's oblique beams. At the transept's end, on a platform adorned with tapestries dedicated to Saint Remy, stood the sacred relics, the holy ampulla, a sealed glass vessel containing the sacred oil, and the pastoral staff of the saintly bishop. Tradition held that this oil, descended from heaven at Clovis' baptism, was essential to consecrate the king. The cardinal placed the ampulla on a velvet dais, while a trembling page brought the scepter and the champagne crown, meticulously crafted with lilies and pearls. As Charles VII advanced, the canons bowed, making way for the Dauphin. Jeanne stepped back a few paces, her gaze turning to the central dome, where, above the stalls, a stone bird carved in the vault seemed to come alive. An unexpected breeze rippled the banners. The torches flickered, casting dancing shadows like mythical omens, a sign that the heavens were watching. The moment of anointing arrived. The archbishop, dipping his finger in the golden oil, traced the cross on the king's forehead, then his chest, shoulders, and hands. With each touch, a murmur swept the nave. The faithful crossed themselves, while Jeanne, hands clasped, let a silent tear fall. Charles knelt before the altar, the scepter beside him, and received the crown, first lightly placed on his forehead, then solemnly adjusted. A distant thunder rumbled outside, as if applauding the sacred act. In a flash, the crowd cried out, "Long live the King of France!" Trumpets blared, answering the cathedral's knell, and showers of flowers were tossed from the galleries, while servants poured sacred wine into silver goblets to celebrate. Jeanne watched the festivities, her heart swelling with joy and reverence. She had carried an ordinary man to the throne of kings. After the ceremony, in the North Gallery, tapestries embroidered with biblical scenes hosted the princely banquet table. Barons and bishops crowded around gold and silver platters, roasted pheasants, suckling pigs, honey-poached pears, and champagne wines. But Jeanne withdrew to a window, gazing over the endless champagne plain, still scarred by war. She murmured, "France, my country, may this coronation heal your wounds." In the shadow of the pillars, the Dauphin joined her, placing a humble hand on her shoulder. "Jeanne, without you, none of this would have been possible." She smiled, pensive. "I was only the voice that called you. Now it is for you to rule." Her words resonated like a prophecy. The now united kingdom must rise into an era of peace and hope, founded on faith and bravery. Thus ended the coronation, sanctified by celestial grace and the strength of a young girl with an extraordinary destiny. In centuries to come, July the 17th, 1429, would be remembered as the day the Maid inscribed her name in France's annals, raising the standard of hope above the ruins of war. After Reims, offensives and counterattacks. When the sacred procession left Reims, the Maid left behind the splendor of Gothic vaults and the scent of melted candles. The soldiers, buoyed by the coronation's enthusiasm, resumed their march in tight formation, the white standard at the forefront like a beacon of salvation. July's sun baked the champagne plain, down to the parched furrows where peasants, their brows marked by thirst, paused to behold this procession from another age, half miracle, half legend. From the first days, Jeanne set the pace, no prolonged rest, but ritual halts near forgotten sanctuaries where stone altars were raised and the Salve Regina was recited. Clear water from a portable well flowed into silver chalices, while the chaplain murmured litanies and supplications. The countryside sounds, the croaking of frogs in the marshes, the rustling of a heron's wings over a pond, took on a sacred resonance. On July 20th, word spread that a Burgundian army, reinforced with English mercenaries, was preparing to retake Chartres. Jean, without waiting for a full report, ordered a forced march westward. The horses galloped through wilted sunflower fields, raising clouds of ochre dust. Each stride resonated like a note of war. The beast's breath stirred the acrid scent of warm soil. Approaching Chartres, the city raised its clear towers and labyrinth of narrow streets under flickering light. The walls, cracked by gunpowder, still bore the marks of stones hurled by siege engines. Jeanne, perched on a hillock, scanned the battlements. Black and red banners snapped in the breeze. Without hesitation, she gripped her war staff. "Knights, we will strike at the city's heart." A hoarse laugh answered, but the maid's intense, ember-like gaze silenced all mockery. The battle took place at the orchard's edge. French crossbowmen, hidden behind apple-tree hedges, loosed their bolts, while pikemen formed a wall of bristling points. The sun reddened everything, turning wheat stalks into a blaze. Suddenly, a horn's cry tore the air. The poorly positioned Burgundian line fell back before French audacity. Jean, sword drawn, urged the cavalry, "Keep the pressure!" The chargers surged, cleaving the dust in sparkling showers, and victory tipped. But the joy was short-lived. In the city's gardens, English archers emerged from bushes, loosing their longbows in a sinister crackle. The French, caught off guard, staggered, their mail armor ringing under arrow impacts. Jeanne, amid the carnage, raised her standard, "Rally under my banner's shadow." At her feet, the wounded found refuge, and the men, galvanized by her example, reformed the fray, pushing the enemy toward the gates. In the narrow streets, the melee became a duel of shadows and clinks, swords against swords, axes against shields. Each blow carried the promise of a free tomorrow. The walls trembled under the impacts, and the cathedral's stained glass tinkled like miniature knells. Finally, a horse collapsed before the main gate, opening a breach for the infantry. Jean's men, driven by a single rallying cry, entered the city, sealing its deliverance. Despite Chartres' capture on July 24th, English counterattacks intensified. An enemy detachment, under cover of a moonless night, infiltrated the suburbs and set fire to fodder-filled barns. Flames erupted, devouring wattle walls and casting dancing shadows on houses as fire consumed souls. Jeanne heard the peasants' screams, and with tears streaming down her cheeks ordered, "Cut off the enemy's supplies." In the morning mist, her scouts reported a hidden supply convoy in a wooded valley. She spurred forward, alone, leading a light squad. The underbrush rustled with life, snapping twigs, singing tits, a startled boar's flight. At a hawthorn thicket's edge, the English rested under a makeshift roof. With a sharp gesture, Jean signaled her men, "Surround them silently." Swords drawn, they swooped like a flock of hawks. The surrender was immediate. The prisoners lay down, abandoning muskets and cannons. On return, she distributed bread and cheese to Chartres' besieged residents, starved for weeks. The rustic scent of freshly baked loaves mingled with curdled milk restored a moment of peace to the battered city. tears of gratitude mixed with the red dust of the ramparts. Jeanne knelt on the parvis, and an old man, kneeling beside her, whispered, "You are God's angel. Without you, we would be lost." She answered only with a gaze of iron and tenderness. As July gave way to August, the maid and her companions turned toward Paris. Despite weary bodies and worn weapons, the flame of hope did not waver. In the air, heavy with omens, crows circled royal towers, cawing as if warning of a fiercer struggle. Jeanne, her face turned to the horizon, murmured, "Paris will fall if God wills it." Her words echoed in France's soul, ready to follow her epic to the end of the walls. Chapter 4. The Fall at Compiègne. The morning of May 23rd, 1430, dawned under a low, heavy sky, where clouds, swollen with threatening rain, glided silently above Compiègne's roofs. The massive gray stone towers stood damp like weary sentinels, while morning mist spread in ethereal layers over the surrounding forest. Jeanne d'Arc, stripped of Reims splendor, had traded her gleaming armor for a lighter chainmail coat, wearing only her helm and sword, ready to defend the Dauphin's city. Her boots slipped on the wet cobblestones, stirring a whisper of water and mud with each step. For weeks, the maid had governed Compiègne's defensive operations with resolve. She had ordered the reinforcement of wooden palisades, the setup of earthen barricades, and the digging of trenches facing the Croix Blanche, a strategically vulnerable access point. Elite marksmen stood sentinel along the ramparts, perched on makeshift trestles, aiming at every moving shadow for signs of a Burgundian scout. Despite the damp chill, the heady scent of resin from nearby trunks seeped into the streets, infusing the air with a forest's reminder. Yet Jeanne's hope was shadowed by persistent rumors. Some advisers whispered that the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had secretly offered a ransom for her capture, desiring her glory as a political trophy rather than a mere military victory. Others spoke of possible betrayal by wavering lords, torn between throne loyalty and the lure of a Burgundian alliance. In her tent, clad in plain fabric, the young leader improvised prayers, her lips tracing the rough beads of her rosary, while in the candle's flame she sometimes discerned the dance of spectral silhouettes, an ominous portent of her fate. At dawn, the Burgundians launched their assault. Ridges of heavy knights emerged from behind the low village willows, forming an imposing cavalry spearhead. The charge shook the palisades, hurling wood splinters and sparks as deadly arquebus powder began to crackle. Jeanne, convinced her duty was to rally the troops, rushed out of the Saint-Remy gate, brandishing her white standard. Her cry resounded like thunder, "For France and for Charles!" The defenders, galvanized, repelled the initial assault, breaking the cavalry's chaos with a wall of lances and halberds. But the enemy, cunning and patient, staged a diversion. Light units infiltrated the suburbs discreetly, disguised as fleeing peasants, brandishing scythes to deceive the guards. Halfway to the Aisne River, a detachment feigned surrender, laying down arms and armor before a small service gate. Intrigued, Jeanne followed them into a narrow passage between wattle huts, her heart pounding as she trailed the men toward a spiraling path to the inner courtyard. When she glimpsed the main street below, bathed in damp chiaroscuro, a sudden shout rang out. A line of Burgundian pikemen blocked the passage, their blades and points glinting with brutal shine. Trapped, Jeanne raised her sword to defend her stance, but one by one her companions fell under a rain of arrows and mace blows. The sharp clatter of weapons against armor echoed off the walls like a sinister funeral bell. Despite the melee's whirlwind, Jeanne defended each step with the fearlessness that had once carried her at Orléans. She invoked her holy visions aloud. Michael, Margaret, Catherine. Her blade cleaved the air, repelling lances and maces, but fatigue, surprise, and the betrayal of those who had sworn loyalty overcame her momentum. A rope looped around her wrists, pinned her to the back of a horse, swept away by the enemy crowd. In a final surge, she struggled, her knees striking the mount's flank, as Compiègne's walls faded into a confused hum. The once proud ramparts retreated into the mist, and the towers, blind, seemed to weep under the fine rain. Through the raindrops, her tears mingled with the sky's water, forming a veil of bitterness and resignation on her face. Taken captive, she crossed the drawbridge to be led to the St. Louis Tower, where Burgundy's executioner awaited. The prisoners, lined along the muddy path, watched her recognizable silhouette in silence. Tarnished armor, dented helm, chainmail coat, buttoned over a worn robe. The clinking of her shackles resounded like a knell in the morning air. In the dank, moss and soot-covered dungeon, Jeanne felt the cell's damp chill bite her bones. Faint light rays filtering through a narrow embrasure drew wavering bars of light on the floor like imaginary bars. The metal bars cast moving shadows, creating the illusion of an endless labyrinth. Alone in this stone lair, she fell to her knees, her face turned to the thin ray of light. She murmured a final prayer, her lips almost forming a smile despite the pain. My God, if this is your will, let me endure this torment for my homeland's deliverance. In the dungeon silence, her vow echoed, the sound of an unshakable soul. Thus ended Jeanne's bravery at Compiègne, a prelude to the trials that would forge her eternal legend. The Trial of Rouen. On January 9, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was led from her damp cell in the heart of Rouen's keep, escorted by a troop of English soldiers in armor blackened by siege smoke. The pale dawn barely filtered through narrow embrasures, casting wavering shadows on the stone walls, both alive and unsettling. She was led under a vaulted archway, its keystones clinking ominously, before climbing a spiral staircase where each step creaked under her weight. The acrid scent of soot and decay rose from the depths, and in the icy air, Jeanne felt her chainmail tighten like a steel yoke. In the great hall of the Palace of Justice, transformed into an exceptional tribunal, a large judge's table stood under black draperies. 13 English ecclesiastics and jurists, clad in purple robes edged with fur, sat smoothly and impassively, their gazes stern. The long, narrow hall mingled the acrid smell of ancient wood with the sweeter scent of melted candle wax, while winter wind slipped through grilled windows, sending shivers across faces. The murmurs of the crowd, officials, clerics, and onlookers, formed a low rumble, suspended between curiosity and restraint. Jean was led to the room's center, facing prosecutor Jean Massieu, whose thin, disdainful face seemed carved from judgment's ivory. He rose, his fingers brushing the binding of a thick register, and in a cold voice listed the charges: perjury, heresy, sorcery, wearing men's clothing, and claiming to hear illusory voices, so many crimes against the Church and the Crown of England. A shiver ran through the assembly, while torches cast a theatrical halo behind the prosecutor. Jean, her hands bound in shackles, stood with pride. Her hair had been shaved, leaving red furrows on her scalp, but her eyes, blazing with defiance, betrayed neither fear nor remorse. To her right, the Dominican Cochon, Bishop of Beauvais, raised an accusing finger. "Maid, your visions are the devil's inventions. You have deceived the weak and ignorant." His voice echoed in the vault, each syllable marked by anger's echo. Unwavering, Jean replied in a clear voice, "You judge me by your interests, not by the truth. If I have lied, may God shatter me to dust. If I speak true, may your judgments crumble." Her eyes lit with an inner flame, and in that moment some onlookers thought they heard, beneath the chandelier's creaking, an imperceptible murmur. Justice. The interrogations began. She was pressed with theological questions: the nature of the Trinity, the doctrine of the Incarnation, canonical precepts on heresy. Each of Jean's responses, shaped by her confessor's teachings and her faith's simplicity, confounded her examiners. When accused of wearing men's clothing, she retorted, "I took these garments only to preserve my modesty and my life." Her sincerity stirred a murmur. Some judges exchanged uneasy glances. On February 24th, after 15 days of hearings, an event broke the trial's tragic monotony. Jean was allowed to call her celestial voices before the tribunal. She stood, pale but resolute, and closed her eyes. "I tell you, they speak to me every day. I do not summon them to deceive, but to serve the King and the kingdom." In the heavy silence, dust floated in a sunbeam, as if the air itself revered her vow. To test her good faith, Cardinal Provost Sedil proposed an exorcism. The Christian ritual would be invoked to expel any demon. But when asked to perform the holy water cleansing and ritual formulas, Jeanne simply said, "If God is in me, His word suffice." The priests, disconcerted, whispered among themselves. Some feared she was protected by a force beyond their knowledge. On February 21st, 1431, the sentence was read. In a funereal silence, Monsieur declared Jeanne contumacious, having not abjured her supposed errors. She was deemed relapsed and condemned to be handed to secular authorities for supreme punishment. At these words, a sudden wind rushed through the open windows, lifting the judge's robes and extinguishing the candles. The Gothic statue silhouettes, lit by a final trembling glow, seemed to lean toward the prisoner, as if absolving her of injustice. Jeanne, standing, heard the sentence without flinching. Her gaze lingered a moment in the dark nave where the vaults met in a starry stone canopy. Then she murmured softly, "If I must die, may my sacrifice serve France." A tear slid down her shaved cheek, shining with unbroken faith. The judges, frozen in their verdict, suddenly seemed chilled, aware they had orchestrated one of history's greatest trials. She was led back to prison in chains, while the crowd dispersed in whispers of condemnation and pity. In the corridor, Jeanne paused, placed her hand on the cold stone wall, and whispered, "Lord, I commend my spirit to your hands." Behind her, a crow passed, beating the air with its black wings as if sealing a pact between earth and heaven. Thus ended the Rouen trial, a clash of fervor against rigor, faith against legalism. The sentence, despite its heavy chains, could not imprison the maid's nascent legend, whose voice, stronger than all judgments, was poised to echo through posterity. Martyrdom and Legacy. At the first light of dawn on May 30th, 1431, Rouen draped itself in mist and a funereal silence. The borough's cobblestones clung under the guards' hooves, while half-timbered facades, blackened by siege soot, seemed to hold their breath. Jeanne, led from her cell to the cadence of the round clock, still wore her threadbare chainmail coat, and her face, despite fatigue and hunger, retained the glow of unshakable conviction. Her bound fists bore the imprint of irons, but her posture straightened with the dignity of a crownless queen. The Vieux Marché Square, paved with uneven slabs and dark cobbles, was already filled with a dense crowd. Petty merchants eager to sell relics and rosaries, onlookers in worn cloaks, nobles hidden behind rich gold-stitched velvets, and limping beggars among the passers-by. In a corner, a crude wooden scaffold rose, its arch topped with an iron gutter holding a massive knotted rope, a sinister noose meant to conclude the ordeal. The pyre, set on a lower platform, was surrounded by alder and oak faggots, its careful assembly promising a slow, painful combustion. At her passage, the English soldiers fell silent, forming a narrow corridor of raised lances, creating a menacing tunnel. Jeanne walked, unperturbed, to the square's center under the stone crucifix erected in memory of martyrs. The bells of Notre Dame de l'Armor rose at once, a grave and solemn knell echoing off the roofs like a call of destiny. Around her, the wind rippled her still long hair, now escaping from beneath her dull veil. The executioner, clad in black, approached and adjusted the rope meant for the garrote. At his side, Jeanne stood taller, her blue eyes burning with serene light. "May God receive me," she whispered clearly. A murmur ran through the crowd, mingling curiosity, fear, and pity. Children, gripping the platform's bars, watched the young woman's shadow stretch across the stone. The priest tasked with abbreviating the ordeal, Brother Nicholas, stepped forward, holding a chalice of holy water and a missal. He gently placed his hand on Jeanne's shoulder, and she bowed her head, murmuring the prayer of commemoration. "I believe in God, the Father Almighty." Her lips articulated each word precisely as the wind scattered rose petals carried by praying faithful. When the final order rang out, "Chain her to the post," 2 guards brought her to the central pole, securing her arms and feet with wide leather straps. The cold stone's touch made her shiver, but she kept her eyes raised to the sky, as if offering a final plea to the Creator. The fire was lit beneath the pyre. The flames first licked the lower faggots, producing an orange glow and a sinister crackle. The resinous alder wood ignited first, sending sparks into the damp air. Jeanne let out a final sigh, barely audible. "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Her words carried like a suspended hymn, resonating in the square like the echo of a celestial tribunal. The flames then reached the upper faggots, enveloping her chest and face. A plume of black smoke rose, biting the morning sky. The witnesses, seized by emotion, looked away or clutched their neighbor's hand to embrace their fate. In a surge of humanity, a young servant let out a stifled cry. A horse neighed behind the scaffold as if protesting the injustice. As the fire consumed her clothes and the structure, the smoke cloud climbed the church facade, forming a vaporous column. Red embers swirled, tracing dying stars in the air. Then, at the blaze's peak, a deep crack resounded. The pyre collapsed in a crash of dry wood, scattering embers skyward. When the last flames died, the platform lay gutted, revealing a pile of glowing ashes. The guards, after a moment, approached with brushes to collect the remains, destined for the Seine. The crowd, motionless, seemed frozen in awe and admiration. A gentle rain began to fall like a mute blessing, erasing the ordeal's traces and offering symbolic purification. Jean's body, reduced to ashes, left behind an acrid, sticky scent, which the wind dispersed among the deserted stalls. Improvised reliquaries shattered under the crowd's weight, eager to collect any fragment. A charred hair, a calcined bone, as a tangible memory of a martyr. The English authorities, fearing the spread of popular fervor, swiftly gathered the ashes to cast them into the Seine, but the legend could not be drowned. In the years that followed, the maid's memory only grew. In priories and convents, entire chapters of her trial were recited to denounce the injustice. France's heralds sang her exploits as epics, turning her name into a spiritual banner. In 1456, a new rehabilitation trial initiated by King Charles VII recognized her innocence and condemned her judges for irregular procedure. The trial's records, meticulously copied, circulated in royal and feudal chancelleries, forever restoring Jeanne's honor. Over the centuries, her image became that of a mythical heroine. Bronze statues in public squares, stained glass in cathedrals, epic poems on troubadours' stages. The names of her loyal companions, La Hire, Xaintrailles, Gilles de Rais, faded before her legend strength. Historians, rationalists, or romantic, continued to probe the archives, fascinated by the convergence of supernatural tales and military facts. In Domrémy, a chapel was erected at her birthplace. In Orléans, an olive tree was planted in memory of the city's deliverance. In Reims, a relic of the holy ampulla was placed near the altar where the coronation occurred. Each site became a station of her posthumous pilgrimage, drawing pilgrims, tourists, clergy, and children eager for adventure. In France's heart, Jeanne d'Arc remained the embodiment of national hope, the voice that united a people under the royal banner, the standard that inspired generations of fighters and believers. Her brief, blazing life wove an indelible thread in the collective memory, like a shooting star whose light endures in history's firmament. Thus ends the maid's epic. She left behind a tide of fervor, a monument of tales and songs, an imprint of faith and courage. And each time dawn rises over Lorraine or the sun brushes Rheims' stones, one can almost hear her, in the wind's breath or the river's murmur, pronouncing her final vow. France, I have loved you, and for you I will give my last breath. thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care and see you soon.